All right. Uh, so I think I got the YouTube thing down pat. I'm here today for a Superversive Sunday live stream with Jagi Lamplighter and her Art of Crafting Indiegogo. Art and Craft of Writing Indiegogo. How are you doing today, Jagi?
Very well, thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for having me on.
It's always a pleasure to have one of the Wrights or any of the other Superversives on my live stream. Now let's see
All
here. Tell us a
right.
little bit about the art
So
craft
I
of
think I
writing.
got the YouTube
What
thing
is the
down
what is
pat. Oh
I'm
my
here
I
goodness.
today
will,
for
but
a
I'd like to
Superversive
start with
Sunday
a
live
brief
stream.
announcement for anybody who's already looked at it, and that is that the error that was charging $600 for shipping has been fixed.
Oh, good.
I've had two people ask me about it now. The Indiegogo setup makes it so if you put 6.00, it puts 600. So we had put 6.00 for the shipping for one of the perks. And I've had two people say, well, I'd really like it, but I can't afford the $600 of shipping. So I just wanted to let everyone know that if you were interested in that option, it is now returned to a reasonable $6. So, so the art and craft of writing is a class on the art and craft of writing, believe it or
Oh,
not.
oh my.
And I'll talk a little bit about how it came about, and then what we're trying to do with it. So, quite some time ago, John and I, as we were both writing, came upon an idea that we identified as a writing technique. And it was kind of a big step for us because before that, when I was a young person, I didn't necessarily grasp the way writing was put together, which I really wanted to understand. So I wrote it down for myself as a tip so I'd remember it. Well, over a period of about 5 years, I wrote down, I don't remember how many, 15 or 20 writing tips. And in about 2008, I can't remember exactly, but that was during that period, I ran a blog called Wright's Writing Corner, where this was before Superversive, and it was just a writing blog about writing. And I was kind of inspired by Magical Words, which is a different writing blog about writing. And
Mm-hmm.
I had guest writers on to talk about writing, including some of the people from Words, and also, just other writers I knew. John wrote some stuff, and I wrote for that blog an article about each of the writing tips on my little list of writing tips, which you can still find on my blog. And one of the reasons I did this is that a couple of times I shared it, and I didn't share it with like, hey, this is wise, look at this wisdom. I shared it with other writers with a kind of, here's a few things I figured out. And I was really pleased and surprised how much other writers liked my writing tip list. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like I would just kind of hand it out without really thinking about it, and people were like, "Oh, can I have a copy of this?" They really thought it was valuable to them. So that's why I decided to write articles explaining each tip. And as I said, these were not tips like me telling you what to do. These were tips like me writing down what I wanted to remember that I had learned so I wouldn't forget it. So they weren't like imposing on anybody tips. They were more like personal reminder tips.
Right, right.
But they got a lot of good uh, reaction. So I wrote out a bunch of these articles, and then a couple of times I was invited by, I think it's called Savvy Author or something like that. Savvy Writers. There was a website. I haven't been there in a while, so I don't know. It may still exist. That did free writing classes,
Hmm.
and I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 times I took one of my articles and turned it into a live class where I would give it to people and then answer questions. And they do these live classes. They just had people come in. You didn't get paid for it, but it was a fun thing to do. And it seemed to be pretty successful. So I then had a whole bunch of information about writing. I then added to this two things. One was even before this period started, and part of the inspiration was that I read Donald Moss's book, Writing the Breakout Novel. This book, Donald Moss was an agent. He's a science fiction guy. I'd met him at conventions, and he decided he wanted to know. He defined a breakout novel as you have a novel and you do the exact same amount of advertising as either the last novel the same author wrote or other beginner novels, but suddenly the novel becomes really big. So these weren't novels that people got a lot of push behind. They were novels that hit a sweet spot and reached the audience without expecting to. And he
Mm-hmm.
said, he gets thousands of over the transom manuscripts as an agent. He wondered if these breakout books were actually better. Was it just chance? Like book A broke out, book B could have broken out. So he decided to read 100 of them. And he sat down, he read 100 breakout novels, and he said they actually were better. Not that every book, one was better than every other book, but they were a lot better than the average book that he saw. So he wrote this book about why they were better, analyzing what these 100 books had that the average book coming into him didn't have. And it's the only writing book I've ever seen that I actually found that wasn't like, grammar that
Yeah.
I actually found useful because the way he analyzed it, I understood. I'm not saying another
Yeah.
person might find a different book useful, but to me, it was very useful. And his principles were things that I then kind of springboarded off. One or two of the principles in my writing class are based on his stuff. One, I mention him directly, and I talk about and encourage people to read his book. Others are just more inspired by his work. Um, and so I had that. I had my writing blog based on the writing tips, and then I had Moss's work. But the thing that really brought this class together was I started editing. And when I was editing, I found something I thought was rather interesting, and that was the books I got by people who couldn't really write. They needed a lot of work that I couldn't tell you necessarily ahead of time what it was going to be because maybe they don't actually put grammar sentences together. Or they don't really understand how to write a scene. But the books I got from the better writers, the one who had a pretty good story, but they just weren't, maybe it wasn't reaching the author quite right. I
Mm-hmm.
would, at first I would read them, and what I noticed at first is I read a couple of books that they were really boring to read, and I got to the end of them, I'm like, this is a really good book. So I spent a little while wondering, why was this book that I really enjoy when I look back at what the author's doing with it, and what he's trying to say, and was I so uninterested at first? And I figured it out, and I can sum up really the whole main idea in one sentence, which is a lot of times they didn't tell you what was motivating the character until the very end because they kind of made it up as they went along.
Mm-hmm.
So the information that would make us care, the information about what the character cared about, which is what makes the reader care, was at the end. So really all I was telling them was move it to the beginning. But there
Mm-hmm.
were 3 points. So that's the whole secret. But there were 3 points. One of them was that, and there were 2 other things that I realized I was telling the authors over and over again, basically the same 3 things. So I took those 3 things and I turned them into articles. And then I said, okay, now I basically have the backbone of a class where I can teach the different principles that I got, doing this process that I've mentioned. Some of them I've taught before on Asabi authors, and include, these insights that I had into what you need to do to really catch the reader as you go along. And I decided, and I taught it as a live class 2 years ago. I had a couple of teenagers. We tried it out. Obviously, there's a lot you can do with it with live people that you can't really do otherwise. But it was basically the same information. And the way the whole class, which is not what we're only trying to fund a little bit of it right now, but assuming eventually we get it all out, the whole class actually we started with word, we went to paragraph, we went to, we went sentence, paragraph, word, not, it was something in between there. I forget what they're called, but a little part of a word of a sentence, paragraph, dialogue, and then worked into the sections of story. And I still have this as when you look at the whole, like about 24 lessons, I have these earlier, more technical ones too. And if eventually, hopefully, we'll get them all moved on to. So before I say what we do, what Superversive, the next step came when Jason said, he'd like to have some video classes available, writing classes that people can watch as videos. And a few years ago, I got as a present from a friend James Patterson's master class, and a group of friends and I got together and took this class. And I really liked the way it was presented. It was a series of short videos, 5-10 minutes each. Some were short, some were a little longer, presenting an idea. And I thought when Jason came up with this, I said, well, we could take the writing class and turn each class into a short video, and we'd have something a lot like his thing where a person could buy a single video if they really wanted to know about characters or something, or they could buy the whole class and watch it in order, or they could buy a section of it, like just the things that had to do with plot, or whatever it is. So this was our idea, and I got together with Ken Dickinson, who's a wonderful fellow who's a narrator and does narration for Superversive and a lot of other people.
And
He
he's in
looks
the
like a
chat right
Viking.
now.
Oh, cool. Hi,
Hey.
Ken. Anyway, he signed on as our narrator, and you can hear him on the little kind of promo video on the Indiegogo site. We have a little promo video, and we got Ben Zwitzky, who is our videographer, and you can kind of see in the promo video a little bit of what we're shooting for. But the idea is that I have these lessons. I'm gonna write, go over them. They're basically written out and go over them. There are certain sections where it's me talking. That's probably going to be me talking to the camera. Short excerpts about my personal experience that I use to illustrate things. The rest of it's going to be Ken reading it in his nice, really easy to understand narrating voice. And Ben's going to add graphics and make it, interesting to look at. And then we're going to make them available. So that's what the campaign is about. It's getting started so we can do the first few. And I'm really happy to say that we funded and we're almost halfway to our first stretch goal. We're like $11 short of being halfway to our first stretch goal. And I know there's at least one person out there who wanted to pledge who held off because of the $600 shipping. So, we may get his pledge eventually. So that's the basics of where this came from and what we're doing. And the idea is to have something that's easy to watch, easy to understand, fun. It will have a book with it that this is how the master class was done. And I thought I'd do something similar because it was easy to work with. It'll have an ebook with it that has the exercises in it. I don't think it would make a lot of sense to put the actual exercises, hey, try it yourself exercises, in the videos. It'd be hard to stop and see what to do. So and we'll also offer the whole thing once we get it together. One of the perks is we'll put it together as an ebook if you'd rather that, either with or instead of the videos. But so that's what we got. We also are hoping to get some videos eventually from other people. We have a promise that if we hit our stretch goal, John Del Rose will make us a marketing video, which would be fun because that's not something that's my expertise. The author, DJ Butler, has offered to do some kind of video for us as a possible extra stretch goal if we go further. And we have other authors in mind that we've either approached or would like to approach that we don't have anything set for me to say about yet. Where eventually we'd like to have not only my course, but other things that you could download from the however we set up the site for buying it.
Yeah. And there'll always be a lot of things to work on, and anything that helps people write more, write better, write more often is just a good thing to have.
Right. And that's one of the keys. So when I started, things were quite different than they are now. And the only thing you could do then to increase your sales was write better, because the only thing that sold books was word of mouth. Advertising didn't do anything, no matter how much money they spent on it. It wasn't
Yep.
100% true, but it was like 89% true.
Yep.
I mean, there were certain times when they put a lot of money behind a book and it actually made a difference. But and what later on when they came up with things like putting them in the front of the bookstore, I'm sure that made a difference. But at one point, basically, it was just writing better. Now there's a lot more. There's marketing. There's all these other things.
Yep.
But it's still the case that once you've sold your first book, if you want the person to come back and read more books, you've got to give them a good quality book. And there's so much out there, and there's so many people I run into who are like, well, I don't like to take a chance on anything because I've read some really bad stuff. So I started thinking one of the best things that we can do as writers to make it so that we have more readers is help other writers write better books
Yep.
so that the readers, because there's nothing that makes you want to read a good book better than when you just finished a good book. You know, if you've just finished reading, you're much more likely to go, gee, I really enjoyed reading that. What else is out there? Well, if you're in a day and you're not reading, you're probably going to watch a video or you're going to play a game or something. But
Mm-hmm.
so that having good books is one of the main things that writers can do to support each other. So that was one of the ideas behind doing this course, was to just make a way for writers to up their game, to improve what they're doing, to make to learn things like what you have to put up front to help engage your reader so that the story you're already telling can be really enjoyable, even though it's not really different from the story you were telling before you made that change. If you know what I'm saying,
Yeah.
same basics are there, but just a slight. And I had been saying this to my authors I was editing for a while, and when my last book 4, was going to come out, I realized I had to cut it randomly in half because it was just going to be too long. So I said, "Oh, I'm going to apply what I tell the writers I work with." So I applied some of the principles I use. It took me like an hour or two. I had to write one short scene and add a couple little things, move a few things around. And I had several people say this is her most focused book ever, which really amused me because it wasn't, but it gave the feeling of it. And that's what the reader needs. The reader needs to have the feeling that certain things are going on so that they can follow the story and enjoy it,
Yep.
you know? And basically that's what we're offering here. We're trying to offer a chance to help people enjoy the story that they want to, that these people want to write, and have them and write them and get across what they want to say. You spend so much time writing a book, if there's
Mm-hmm.
little things you can do that make it so that the book is more enjoyable to the reader, it's worth a little extra time to do them so that you can walk away thinking, well, I spent this time and somebody's appreciating it.
And it's really important. Like I've been kicking around Amazon and stuff like that. There's been a trend which I think is absolutely ruinous, but whatever, where authors have been selling all of their books compressed into one massive book, and it's not like a natural trilogy. We're talking like 6 books in one uh, Kindle
Mm.
thing,
Yeah, they're
and
they're
it's
just
like
trying to get Kindle reads by putting
yeah.
everything together.
And
Yeah,
it's like I get it, but I also don't get it because many times I'm reading through this book and I just go, put it down. I could be a third of the way through like a 9 book series or like 10 pages into some, sci-fi space opera that's proving to be super generic. Um, it's like I understand when people talk about marketing, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't want to read well marketed garbage.
Right. And it's
So,
a lot of things like that might help a particular author in the short term, but it doesn't help all the authors in the long term,
yeah,
and so I mean, there's certain tricks of marketing that are the kind of thing if you learn them, you can do them, and they don't do anybody any harm. I'll give you an example of a simple trick I was taught that if you know it, it's better, but it doesn't do any harm, and that is if you have an ad for your book, it should say exactly what the Amazon blurb is going to say in one way or another, because people have found if you put up an ad and that's cool about the book and they go to the Amazon page and they see something, even if both things are true of your book, if what's on the page doesn't match what they think they're looking for, they won't buy.
yep,
Very simple advice, good to know, doesn't do anyone any harm. But there are certain things where someone just figures out how to trick the system that, yeah, okay, you're getting this temporary benefit, but what you have is things like what just happened to you. You're like, okay, this isn't, this is not good enough. I'm not going to put out the time. And now you're less likely to buy the next one.
Oh, I don't even remember their names.
Yeah,
Like I
exactly.
memory hole really hard when it comes to these things. Or it's like I didn't even buy this book, but it was a couple of soldiers off duty. All of a sudden, alien attacks their cruise liner. This is like the first two sentences. I'm like, ooh, this actually sounds interesting. You have a confined space. You have two, probably generic, but quite serviceable,
Yeah.
soldier characters, and one's going to be funny, one's going to be serious, or whatever you have, or they're going to be snarky or whatever. And then it's like, but then the third sentence ruined it for me, where they like get stuck in cryogenic sleep. And this is in the description. They get stuck in cryogenic sleep, and all of a sudden it's 300 years in the future, and they have to deal with things as the last ancient soldiers or whatever. And I'm thinking, hold up, what was wrong with the book about two soldiers stuck on a cruise liner with aliens invading?
Right.
Like it.
Right. Because you'd already bought into the interest of that premise, and now suddenly they're changing the premise. Why not start with the premise two old soldiers in the future rather than tease you with a premise that now you've got excited about that they then drop. So yeah, yeah,
Yep.
I can see that. Yep.
And it's I didn't buy the book, I didn't spend any money on it. But then again, whenever people ask me what my stance is, I say I'm Anton Ego from Ratatouille. If it's not a good book, I don't read it.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just
yeah.
waiting for a rat to learn how to type so I could find love again or something. I don't know. It's hard life, Jaji.
It
But
is a
more
hard
about
life.
the writing thing. I did take a part of your prototype class,
You
and
did.
I
You
did
did.
enjoy it. The biggest thing I took from it was the two, I mentally I call it the two prong thing, but it's
Yeah.
where you have two plot lines within the story. So you have like the A, the B, the hero who's trying to avenge his father, and then the love interest, and the fact that he's interested in her, but his rival happens to be the son of his old boss who was murdered, and he's blamed for it. So you get these
Exactly.
these two things together, these two interesting lines that push the plot forward. And of course, you can weave them together in the end, or you can spring them out. But there's multiple levels of interest going, and even when the hero is going to be alone, he's still going to hear about or experience things that the guy is doing, whether or
E-
not
e-
he's a part of the conspiracy.
Exactly. And that is so important. In fact, I'm revamping my own current, most recent novel to add second plot strings in certain areas where I didn't have them for just that reason. And when I have edited books that were from writers who, were just starting out, and the number one mistake I think that a lot of newer writers make is to have scenes where only one thing is going on.
Yep.
And even advanced writers can make this mistake at times. I In fact, I think that's what happened with Robert Jordan. I haven't actually read any of the later Robert Jordan books, but I've been told by friends who've discussed them at length that he got to a point where it was kind of more just the characters talking and showing their personality and no second plot issue going on.
Hmm.
And that phenomena leads to a certain type of mental fatigue in the reader. It's like the two plot lines normally kind of keep you interested because, it could be going off in a different direction at a moment. So you're kind of wondering and anticipating.
Yep.
But if you don't have that, it becomes kind of, for lack of a better word, lightweight.
Yeah.
And sometimes a writer you like, you'll enjoy these scenes anyway. But if it's not a writer you really like, if you don't really care about the characters, you lose interest at that point. So the two string or two prong, however you want to think it. I always think of two threads being woven together, so it's two string. But um, it's really one of the most important things that a person can do is just go over their scenes and make sure there's these two ideas going on at once. And sometimes we think there is and there isn't. And sometimes we can tell right off there isn't. But that's one of the ideas. But you just want to say you mentioned a step that I didn't mention, and that is I actually have given the class a couple of times online between when I gave it in person and it's here. It's
Hmm.
been polished a few times by people like the one I gave for you guys. We had the guinea pig class where we tried it out. And
Yeah.
what we learned out of that was that it's better in short periods. It's, it was people seemed to really enjoy it, but we had too many weeks that was we were getting close to Christmas, and a number of people came back later to try it again because they're like, I can't do it right now. So in the future, as far as the live classes, probably going to be more likely to do uh, 2 week intensives where you study like three to four of the lessons rather than these really long ones, because
Right.
I also used to take classes of these kinds. That's one of the reasons that I thought of this. There's a woman named, I think her name is Maggie Larson, and she's like a psychologist who's also a writer. So she gives all these classes that deal with, among other things, how to put across emotion, which is
Hmm.
something I thought I was really bad at years ago. So I took a number of her classes. And the model for how I do it in person, where there's things and you have a group of writers work together and they swap back and forth, I got from her. Um, but I also had the same thing. She would give like 6 or 8 week classes, and I was really excited the first month or so, but it was really hard to keep it up towards the end. Even if it was interesting, it's just a lot of time to put into something when you're an adult and you're working and stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of the reasons why we trying to do the videos, is that then you can do it on your own time.
Oh yes.
You do a few and you want to take a break, and then you do a few more. And we will try to keep up the online classes too. So if someone buys into it and watches the videos and they want more of the, I found in these things that watching the videos is a help.
Yeah.
But of course, sometimes having a live person to interact with makes me actually do the thinking, and that's valuable too. So it's valuable. Some people can actually do it on their own. They'll watch a video, they'll do a lesson, and
Yeah.
I have done this, and that's valuable. Sometimes it's valuable to get a group of people. That's why when I said when I did the master class, I got a group of people together, and I got actually several of the people I'd taken Maggie Lawson's class with, and then a couple of other people, and we all bought it, all did it together, and would email each other our responses to the questions and things. And I encourage people to consider doing that. If you want to check out the art and craft of writing, consider doing it with a friend or two, and have the group of you, so you have someone to send your stuff to, and it keeps you motivated.
Yeah. I got a question here from Shelley Stewart. Would 3 strings be too much?
I'm not sure that there's such a thing as too many strings per se. When I say per se, I mean theoretically, there's not too many strings.
Provided you're
In
not doing like 50 strings.
right, because in reality, most writers have probably a level which they can handle. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Some writers can handle a lot more strings than others, but certainly 3 strings would not be too many, because often you have, let's say 2 major plot lines and a subplot going or something like that.
Yeah.
So having, as long as you are handling it well, having extra couple strings in there is not going to be a bad thing. Also, a string is not always a plot issue. Some scenes, the string could be the location or something about a character you're meeting, where the interest of what you're finding out about the location, if it's presented in a way that's interesting, can act like the second string. Um,
Ah.
so in some scenes, you might have 2 plot lines going, and also some reveal about the history of the old haunted house or something, and you really have 3 strings going there,
Like a
and they help each
ghostly
other.
ball as
Yeah,
the
yeah,
necromancer does something or other, and then you know or so like it's not so much something plot related, but it is relevant to the story.
right, right. So if let's say you have a ghostly ball and it's in a house, and the house belonged to the family, and it's let's say it's a mystery, and as you're going around the house, you're learning about some of the interesting things that are in the house that were owned by the family, and maybe in those things you're learning are some clues that later on will actually turn out to be, help you figure out who killed great uncle Tom or whatever, you know what I mean? But
Right.
but part of the interest at the time is, oh, isn't this house cool? And you need to
Yes.
write, and some writers are better at doing this than others. But so it can be plot, but it can also be something like that. but basically it's that your top action, whatever it is, your either fight or your conversation has some other thing that it's contrasting with.
Right.
And yeah, you can have a bunch of them. Sometimes you can have quite a few that are going on at the same time. You might be learning about character, learning about the house, and have three plot lines going. And the there's no like rule, hey, 10 is too many. It's more a matter of, if you feel it's smooth and it's enjoyable, good. If you feel like you're getting too many things going on once, plot clues flying around like bats, at that point, maybe you need to take an issue out and put it in a different scene. So
Yeah. And it's like the thing about like George R. R. Martin and Vox Day and Tolkien and others is that they didn't write their super huge epics until they were like into their 40s.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
Tolkien spent his entire life working on it, but really he spent most of the time making the languages, and then as a professor he started working on everything else. Or George R. R. Martin. George R. R. Martin used to be a science fiction writer, and
yeah.
then like he did this and that, and
And
eventually
he was a
started.
Hollywood guy. He
Yeah,
he did Beauty and the Beast, the TV show, and some other stuff. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, he'd been out there writing books for a long time. He has that one. Didn't he have one about a vampire on a steamboat on the Mississippi? Is that him? And
I
he
don't
had
know. I
another
got the
one
ones that are
called
vampires on spaceships.
Dying of the Light, which anyway, he did a lot of things for quite a while.
Yeah,
I think Fever Dream was the one I'm thinking about. I could be mixing it up with something else. The point is, he'd been out there. He'd done a lot. He'd
yeah.
looked into it. He'd written. And then he hit an idea, and I don't know what he was thinking. His idea was. I always thought his idea was Game of Kings with fantasy, because it even called it Game of Thrones. It had that feel like history meets fantasy.
Yeah, it's the
Um,
War of the Roses plus this and that, and
yeah,
threw in some
exactly.
dragons and things got weird.
And then, like Tolkien, somebody described Tolkien as a war novel meets fantasy. And I think a lot of the books that really break out are books that take two completely different lines of story and mix them in a new way.
Yeah,
You know, and so both of those guys got something like that. And uh, Vox has a kind of a Roman thing going with his. It's nice.
yep,
Um, but I think you're right. I mean, the guys who write these really complicated, long, arcing things with many plot lines usually have done quite a bit of work to work up their writer chops before they get to that working. There's plenty of
hmm
people who try that and it doesn't work that well. But
yeah. Like it's one of those things where like like if you think back to your first thing, it's like, wow, I'm gonna write this epic about this and that, and then you go back and read it, and it's like, this idea is good, this idea is salvageable, the rest of it though. No, no, thank you. This is never going to see the light of day. But I liked high school
yeah.
me. He was so full. Well, he wasn't really hopeful, but he was Ben. He was as Ben as I am. Uh, so let's see here. So we've talked about the stuff. Shelley says thank you. Um, let's see here. Pax Romana has a good point. And Martin had to sell his soul, and Vox had to collect some skulls for the Skull Throne. Yeah, there's a cost to these things. Somewhere along the line, something somewhere, some thing you gave up to pay for it. Not that that's menacing per se, but you know,
Well, if nothing else, you gave up the time you would have spent doing something other than writing
yep,
when you sat there and did your million words or your billion words or however to get to work out your
10
craft.
years studying TV tropes.
uh,
Whatever works.
yep.
You just have to realize that whatever route you take, it'll give you some strengths, it'll give you some weaknesses. Like a lot of the things I'm discovering is with a lot of the pulp writers and the indie writers, is that unless they're really meticulous like Ryan Niemeyer, they will make choices with their plots that will offend me. Uh, and I'm speaking arrogantly for comedic effect, but like in the recent second most, I can't remember anymore. Terran Armor Core, there's a reveal, and it's done so out of joint. Like it deserved its own novel to build up to this reveal, and it colors
Yeah.
everything beforehand, and it's just out there, put on the table. Somebody starts ranting about it, and doesn't make any sense for her to talk about it. It ruined the entire series for me, and I love Terran Armor Core.
Oh.
And it's not like it makes the writing any worse. Richard Fox's writing is still excellent. He can do mech on mech action scene. He's got the characterization down. He has that noumenal feeling. But he made a play that satisfied some plot threads he needed to tie together, but was a massive flaw in the gem that he was carving out of the rough.
I've noticed that in other stories where I don't know since I haven't read this if this is what you're saying, but I've noticed a phenomena where people will do something that serves a short-term wow.
Yep.
Like it's really impressive that it happens, but then you step back and you start thinking about the long-term ramifications.
Yep.
And the archetypical example was the idea that Captain America had always been a Hydra agent. I
Right.
mean, okay, maybe you get a bit of a shock, but once you start looking over the story and the kids who love him and everything else, it's so monumentally dumb. You know what I mean? And I probably what you're talking about isn't even come near that level. But it's things like that where people will make a decision where they're getting a bang locally for their buck,
Right.
but overall their story is suffering from it. And I
And
must say that's probably a hard thing because a lot of times readers will see something that the author didn't see, and yet they can do their best to try to, you know, have better readers talk it out, look at it.
yeah. And I don't worry about beta readers too much. I do the critique group thing just to keep me motivated week by week.
Yeah, yeah.
I like Scott and Ann, but it's I don't. I just look
You
for
know,
I just I'm not
I
dependent on them.
I I've found that it's very helpful to have somebody to give your finished things to. Like if you know somebody else is going to look at them,
Hmm.
it's much easier to motivate yourself to finish the next chapter.
Oh yeah.
And what they say back may or may not be helpful, but they're doing such a value just by being there. You know what I mean? Because then you go, okay, I got to get the chapter done by the date of the review, critique date. I've had that a number of times. I have a wonderful, wonderful friend who will look at my chapters, which are so valuable. But in
Hmm.
previous years, before the current situation, I had like a critique group, and I would write and send it to them, and it would keep me
Yeah.
on the keeping the pedals going, so to speak.
And it's a lot of people talking about Christopher R. Denote says so the juice ain't worth a squeeze when it comes to clever versus the long term health of the story. Wooly Ram says that John De La Rose outed himself as a filthy furry with Justified. The Inquisition will remember. You're absolutely right. No one, not even the number one Hispanic sci-fi author, John De La Rose, is above the furry Inquisition. Uh, and it's a lot like when I sit down to write a story, I don't worry about like an audience or anything like that. I worry about
Yeah,
whether or not I'm crafting the best thing. And I know that people here want series, and I'm going to stretch a book into 3 novels that are hopefully, still worth reading and stuff like that. Even
yeah,
even as I
yeah.
I move it around, and that's like that's still drawing blood from a stone because I believe that every story has an ideal situation that it can reach. And part of the reason why I have been promoting the art and craft of writing so much and putting on my Facebook and MeWe and all that jazz.
Which we
Uh,
appreciate so
oh,
much.
250 MeWe followers. Uh, Yes, that's right. I run a moderately successful page on a Facebook knockoff. What of it? But
Oh, that's
you
cool.
know, is that these things need to be out there. Like it's, you know, I've talked to Richard Fox about what I've talked before on the live stream, and he gave me his reasons. I'm not going to read out verbatim, of course, but
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and it's like, okay, I can accept that from a business or logical standpoint, but the health of the story suffered, and a lot of these
yeah,
things. And then you know you lose somebody who was promoting and buying your books. So
yeah.
you know the goal isn't to like pump it out, get that shovelware as it's called. You know, guess
Yeah.
what? There's 150 Space Marine stories out there. I'm sure there's like one published a day.
Yeah.
You know, you can do better. You know, this art and craft of writing will help you do better. You know, and if you don't know what to do with it or you're struggling with it, that's what TV tropes are for. Find out what people did successfully, steal it, you know, and then claim that
I
you're so smart to do it yourself.
I actually plan to add a lesson. I haven't written it up yet called "The Trouble with Tropes,"
Ah,
where I'm going to put in some of the information that I talked about at one of the Dragon Con panels, and the writer sitting next to me was absolutely fascinated. Like, started to stop. He was like, "No, no, keep going," and talk about the like the nature of tropes and working with them and what what a writer needs to do and stuff. But
yep,
that's not one that currently exists, but it's on my radar for something to write up for a future one. Um,
absolutely.
from the just from the plotting point of view of how to try to um, how how to use the building blocks correctly as opposed to incorrectly. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah, but I, I, one of the things I really want to emphasize about the art and craft of writing is that the point of it is to be really simple and practical.
yep,
Because I noticed years ago, I used to read a lot of books on writing, and I noticed that the writers who had written but not taught, they tended to write a book and it would say, you absolutely, utterly must, without question, write an outline because that's what I do. And the next one would say, under no circumstance ever write an outline because that's what I do. You know what I mean?
right,
And they did seem to have a sense of writers having a range of how they go about things.
yeah,
I really was really happy when I actually took Moss's class in person once for a weekend class, and he said he called them outliners and organic writers, and he said they both write good books. And he said the organic writers, he says their first draft is their outline. They
yeah.
do more revising. And I love
Oh
that
yeah,
because he wasn't saying this is better or that's better. He's saying, look, these are two different ways of approaching it. And I think that the people who have more of a sense of they've dealt with a lot of writers. Like I remember reading John Gardner, and he'd been a teacher of this, and he seemed to have a more even idea of what writing was rather than, hey, do what I did.
yeah,
But Moss's book was much more of a, hey, here's a short, useful technique. And when I get stuck, I'll still pull out his book and I'll go, wonder if there's one of his exercises I could do that'll help me with this. And I've done that a number of times because they're short and they're to the point. And a couple of them overlap the art and craft of writing, but a lot of them don't, because he
hmm,
and I go in different directions. We just overlap on certain basic points. Um, and that's what I'm trying to do. Something where a person can go, I feel stuck in this scene. I want to go back and hear again what that two strings thing was to see if maybe I'm not doing that or my character really isn't coming to life. Let me take another look at, methods of bringing characters to life. And I'm working on currently something that's going to be a little add-on that I'm just going to throw in for fun,
ooh,
which is a list of 100 questions you can ask your character if you want to interview them.
I love
And
it.
some people do really well developing characters using the stuff I have in the character class. But for some people, or even some characters, just sitting and kind of thinking as if you're talking to them is a really great way to develop them. So I have a list of I have a list, but I need to now redesign the questions to make them a little more intriguing and things like that. But eventually, I'll throw that out there just for fun as just a little add-on. A
Yeah,
100 questions for interviewing your character, so that you can find out what they think and where they grew up and all the other things that's nice to have in the background for, just knowing when you're writing so you can have the character feel like they're fully fleshed out, things like
Yep. And I can attest as an organic writer, like what the critique group sees is my first draft. So in
Yeah,
other words,
exactly.
it's an outline, and as they're
Yeah.
talking to me about things that don't work and do work, I'm thinking, okay, there's a cyber attack, and he shuts off his internet, his mind jacks, and so instead of having it just kind of wash over the house and disappear, I'm going to have him basically get hit by a wave, and it's like being underwater, and it's probing at him. It's looking to get into him, but it can't get in because he's turned off his mind jack. So it improves to be a stronger scene from something that's
Right.
small and just that to
Yeah.
something that would actually be very interesting and develop the world and technology of this far future society more.
Yeah. And those things are both really useful and also only so useful
Yep.
because like for instance, I might occasionally be thinking in my head about what I'm going to say, but I try not to really write much in the way of notes when I edit until I've gotten to the end of the book. Because the whole point of what I do when I edit is I'm trying to get you to tell, bring out the story you want to tell. So I
Hmm.
need to see the story you're actually telling,
Oh
and
yeah.
then, kind of work backwards to how does it support, how does your end support your beginning? How does your beginning support your end? So, sometimes when you do it this way, you get really useful information. Sometimes it's like, well, look, guys, I'm on chapter 6, and the big reveal of what's really going on isn't for a long time. And so there's none of your guesses are going to be correct, and there's nothing I can do about that. You just have to keep reading. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it can be both ways, but I think it can be useful because sometimes you do go, oh wait, I see how this came across. I'm going to run with it. I'm going to really bring it to life.
Yeah.
So just like the example you gave.
It's chapter 10 and you haven't even burned down the village or killed a parent yet? What's wrong with you? Uh Yep. And it's let's see here. Uh let's look at the chat for a second. We're talking here that he said Wooly Ram says that John C. Wright claims that all he does is steal two tropes, rub off the serial numbers, and recombine them. I can agree with that. Pax Romana says, to be fair, only Tolkien can claim originality, and even then, he's a dirty, dirty thief. Wooly Ram says there's nothing new under the sun, and Pax Romana says even Solomon plagiarized. If you ever read Ecclesiastes, I recommend doing so while the depression medication is kicked in, so that you might properly understand the context of when he goes, all is grasping for the wind, and so on and so
Yeah,
forth.
yeah.
Because
Oh,
he
that's
is he
good.
is not talking about pursuing these worldly functions, but the heavenly ones, because there is originality in God.
Yeah, yeah.
Which, mm,
When I was in college, I used to be worried. Well, everything's, so many things have been written. How can I write something that's new? And ironically, the thing that turned it around for me was French class. We translated Pascal, and one of the lines Pascal had said was, "Nothing is written until I write it." And I don't know what Pascal meant to get out of that, but I can tell you what I got out of that. It suddenly occurred to me that what we're really giving people when we're writing is our point of view, as if we're all, rays of God, rays of light coming out from God, and He's given us each a different place to stand and look around. So we each see things differently. And
hmm
that's really what we're doing with a story is we're presenting it as we see it. And
yes,
from that point on, I was less frightened about that issue of, originality. Not that you don't have to put in work. We really do have to put in work because
yep,
I remember John and I once had a conversation about copyright because when I was young, my father worked with public domain stuff, so I knew a lot about copyright. And we watched the copyright go from, 28 to 54 years to suddenly almost 100 years.
right,
So all this stuff, I mean, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe would have been out of copyright if they hadn't changed the rules.
yeah,
And when something comes out of copyright, then you can use it as part of your tradition. You can mix it in, you can build on it.
right,
And we were talking about all the stories we really liked that were copyrighted and how much we wish that we could have used them. And suddenly I said, but the funny thing is our readers are paying us for is to not do that. They're paying us for us doing that extra work to bring the thing to a new, not that they wouldn't enjoy, something that had these other characters in it. I don't mean that. I just mean that what really makes it come alive is that extra work we put in to see it from our own point of view,
Yep.
and to bring out something that maybe the other person hasn't seen. So you do want to do that, and you do want originality from that point of view, but you also don't have to have everything be new. I mean, look how wonderful fairy tales are, and they're kind
Oh
of been the
yeah.
same for a long time, and still, you sit down and read them, and they're really enjoyable. So you kind of have a mix of the fact that you can tell a story that someone else has told and just give it your spin, and that you need to do some work to make it just not the same thing that someone's already read, because otherwise they'll just go read that other book they like.
When I go looking for authors and books and stuff like that, if I find an author I like, I'm not looking for space opera by John C. Wright. I'm looking for space opera by
Right.
John C. Wright, Grandmaster, etc., etc. Not some space opera that happens
Yeah.
to be written. Like I want the
Yeah.
deep themes, I want the high-mindedness, I want the religious themes. I don't want some generic space marine clomping around an alien ship with some half baked horror and then a lurid, poorly written sex scene. Like that's not John C. Wright's style. It's not
Right.
Richard Fox's style. So on and so forth. If somebody comes across my name, I want every book I ever put out to be a Ben Wheeler book. So
Right.
it's that flavor that can only be brought by a unique individual wrought by the hands of God. Um,
Right, and
but
we all have authors who will read anything they write because we just like the way they're seeing the world.
yep,
What's funny? This is not writing related, but this principle proved to be a big stumbling block for the early movies because the early movies tried to make everything run by the studio. They wanted you to go and buy and watch MGM movies as opposed to 20th Century Fox movies. And they
hmm
were surprised and alarmed when viewers wanted to see, yes, you guessed it, the actor. They
yep,
want to see a Buster Keaton movie, not an MGM movie. You know what I mean? And eventually the old system broke up in part for, other reasons, but in part because an actor who everybody liked could just command a much larger audience than the same movie with a different actor in it.
yep,
And the same thing is true with writing. Once we get to really enjoy, like I notice if I read a book by an author I really like, or I watch a movie with an actor I really like, I enjoy it more because it has, like, I recognize things that resonate with me that remind me of this other thing I really like.
yeah,
Well, if I read a new thing or watch a new actor, I might enjoy it really well, but it doesn't have that additional richness. Now, it might later if I read more of that person's stuff and I become a fan. But it just,
yeah,
I think there's, like, it just, think of any of the authors you really like and how excited you are when a new book comes out versus, okay, there's a book that has a similar plot, but
yep,
it doesn't have that, that thing that's making me go, hey, I really want to read that.
yep. And it's like for me, it's Guy Pearce and sci-fi movies. I like Guy Pearce sci-fi movies. Yes, that even means Prometheus, Alien Prometheus, which I understand. Yes, the scene where they could just run out the side is stupid, but it's otherwise I enjoy it. But
Yeah, yeah. I
uh,
mean,
y- yeah,
some stories and movies, when I was young, I was really bothered by continuity and, if they had something that was dumb. But
yep,
after a while, I began to realize sometimes you do have a good thing, and they just don't get everything perfect, and you just have to enjoy it. You know what I mean? So I've
yep,
I've kind of lightened up a lot on how harshly I'm grading things. Because yeah, it's great if everything's perfect, but a lot of times not everything's perfect. So there are big mistakes or big problems that make it hard to enjoy. Uh, but sometimes I think we just have to go, okay, maybe that scene was stupid, but look, the rest of the movie is really enjoyable or whatever.
yeah.
The book, whatever. So
And doing the slush reading, for Superversive Press, I've started to appreciate it. Like as long as this author who I'm reading right now with a book called Chalk doesn't trip up in the last pages that I'm reading, and I'm only 10% through it, and I've already read
Yeah,
this far before. I told him to change a few things that would the massive overall arching part of the story, and he's changed them so far. I'm going to say, Jason, this is pretty good. It's not amazing, but it's pretty good. We should give this guy a shot. I'm not looking for perfection. Like this guy has no clue how to capitalize proper names, and I don't know why, but that's okay.
that's really strange. Usually
It's
it's the opposite, you know? Usually
yeah,
it's the opposite. I don't think I've ever heard of that before. But I can tell you as an editor, you would be amazed at the things that people just don't know how to do.
right.
I have one author whose stuff I really enjoy, but it takes me like 5 to 10 times longer to edit one of his books because I have to correct the punctuation, which is not my forte. I'm a concept, not necessarily
Hmm.
a copy editor. I have to correct the punctuation in every sentence. But the guy's a good writer, so
Yeah,
I forgive him. So,
yeah,
but certain people just don't have certain basic skills of writing, but doesn't necessarily mean their book isn't good. It just means they need some editing.
yeah. And it's a lot of it, can be corrected with courses like the art and craft of writing. It's you can't fix what you're not aware of. I spend a lot of time self-editing, being an organic writer. I want people to tell me if something's wrong. However, these classes can sort of preemptively, hit you in those places and sort of say, hey, look, your weakness is, pacing out a sentence. There, not that you really have sentences, here, but,
Well,
um,
I mean, actually, I actually also do have a grammar class. You know what I mean?
ooh,
Well, one or two of my lessons deal with the nuts and bolts of things I see people make mistakes over and again. I haven't put them forward as the main opening ones because they'd be a lot more boring. But I'll make them available in the book. But for instance, I find out that a lot of writers nowadays don't seem to know how to do the grammar and punctuation for dialogue.
yeah,
And so I have a whole class just on that, how to format, and I send it to people when I think they need it. You know what I mean? But how to format your dialogue that and I must say I've only learned it recently. There's a lot of things about grammar and punctuation that I was not good at until I became an editor and I had to learn them. And now I go back and I'm so embarrassed that I made my poor editor go through this. But just like where you put the commas, where you put the
yep,
periods, or just simple things. It's not. I don't know if this is a rule per se, but it's one of these unwritten rules that you used to never see anyone break. That nowadays I see broken a lot. Is when you have dialogue, one side of the dialogue should always be of your paragraph should be a quote
yes,
mark. In other words, some people will put, he said blah 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 blah, and then what he did. And one of the joys of dialogue is that it's easier to read for the reader. So you don't, as a writer, want to make it harder for your reader to read the dialogue. You want
yep,
that fact that dialogue is easier and you're going to suck them along. So
yeah,
little things like that I have in a thing. And some of the early classes where I mentioned that we had the phrase, that was the word I couldn't think of. We have the phrase in the sentence. I have a class that's just about organizing sentences to make them more interesting, like
yep,
increasing the interest of your sentence. And I have one on how to organize a paragraph. And these things will eventually be made available. I didn't really throw them out there for the people who were already writing when we did our guinea pig class, but I put them together because the kids that I worked with the first time didn't know these things. And so we had a really fun one of the exercises for sentence is you start with like there was a cat, there was a mat, there was a door, and then by the end you have like the cat sauntered down the cobblestone street. You know what I mean? And it was like 3 or 4 levels of how you made your sentence more readable and more interesting. And so that was one of the exercises where you would then do
yep,
the cat one, and then you'd go do your own. And so I do have some that deal with grammar issues and stuff like that, with the hope of just making a person a little more aware. So they are making a few. Not that as a writer, I think you have to get everything perfect, but if you make it easier for your editor, if you make it easier for a publisher, I think your chances are better, you know?
Yeah.
So I do deal with that, but it's not one of the first classes we're offering up front. We're offering up front is the concept, plot, character, theme, uh, issues.
Yeah.
And then we have in the background however, this whole progression where we also have, I have it kind of together as a pack. We'll have this grammar pack, kind of the craft part of it, rather than the art. And that's why I called it the art and craft when I put it together. I was like, okay, we're going to deal with the art of telling a story, and we're also going to deal with the practical craft of writing. I have another short little lesson that again, some of them I don't know if in the long run if all the lessons will be videos or if some of them will be just in book form because some of them are kind of short practical things. But one of them is just based on Jason's experience at Superversive is some basic information about how to submit a manuscript,
Yep.
which we used to all get from Writer's Guide, and nowadays a lot of people just don't know. Just things about how to either find out what your local publisher wants or
Yeah.
basic things that you should do with the formatting of it and things like that.
What I've been
So
telling people is that I want a sentence that's the pitch, a page that's the plot, pure plot. Like I don't care about anything else or how wonderful it is, but just the plot, so I know what's going on, and then the manuscript itself. Just because
yeah,
even if I read something, as long as the pitch and the page like looks like something that could be worth reading, I'll give it a shot because it's like
and that's interesting because when I was a tour author, that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted the brief concept idea, then they
hmm
wanted what they called a synopsis, which or an outline. Originally, I tried to outline it, and eventually I realized they didn't want it outlined. They wanted a 1 to 2 page description
yeah,
that showed what would happen. And then the manuscript, and and I think for exactly the same reasons you say. First you see is does it sound interesting? Second you see is it going to make any sense at all? And
yep,
then you go ahead and read it. And exactly, and that's the kind of thing that hopefully uh that this class will help you with. And as I said, it's my hope that both I and other people will offer additional things so that as we go along we'll have a few videos, and then hopefully as time goes on we'll have more. Right now we're trying to fund the first few. We got the first four. uh we're trying to get six.
yep,
um I think we're at the point now we probably actually managed to do six even if we don't finish this stretch goal, but it'd be great if we do and we even get more in because
yeah.
we have quite a few that we can do, and it would be great to get at least a good 8 or 10 of them because they go together nicely. They kind of build on each other. Some of them kind of refer to each other, and it's a little hard without the other one there to really understand it that well. But
Our
we have time.
oh yeah, our voice actor says nothing irritates me more professionally than authors who expect me to read bad grammar. And Wooly Ram is trash talking the English language, and listen, man, at least we mean what we say and can parse out a sentence, and that's
Yeah,
not true of a lot of other languages. Like it's like Latin. It's like, okay, so you said murder, but in what way? What do you mean? We have about 200 words for different types of murder. Was it sword murder, dagger murder, poison murder, murder in the baths? And I'm exaggerating for comedic effect, but it's like there's a
but only a
whole
little.
only a little, only a little. I'm only joking about like what their actual murder forms are. I'm not joking about their amount of words for killing.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
because they
yeah.
were a violent people.
Well, it's
Um,
like they say that the people up in Alaska, the natives up there, have lots of words for snow, while we tend to have snow.
yeah,
And there's a reason. It really matters up there, and it doesn't matter so much down in Virginia. So yeah, but yeah, it's definitely true, and I know what you mean. I mean, English. It's interesting because one of the things in English is that you don't want to repeat words,
hmm
anything that's bigger than the and too close together. It causes an odd constant kind of dissonance in the thinking of the reader.
yep,
And it's kind of it's but we can do it because in English we have so many words for the same thing.
Yep.
While in certain other languages, Japanese, I think, for instance, that's not a thing. Like they have less words for the thing, and they don't keep changing the word. You know, you can see that like if you listen to anime, you can hear them saying the person's name over and over and over again.
Yep.
And sometimes the voice actors and the subtitles will do that. And sometimes they get a little wise and they don't do it. Because what sounds perfectly normal to the Japanese ear sounds really weird if every 5 seconds I'm saying Ben.
Yep.
so, so I mean, there are differences in what you need to do in English from another language. But English is what we're dealing with. So
Yeah.
English is where we are.
And it's like we use I for everything, but the Japanese have like two for each gender and like a
Yeah,
gender neutral or something. And it's like there's boku for men and then there's ore for men. But
yeah,
apparently, ore is like saying, me, this bastard, like it's super masculine
it's
and half
not.
an insult. Like, and it's like, you know,
Yeah,
uh,
it
eh,
I think it's really interesting the different ways language is used, and it's funny because I hear all this complaint about pronouns, and in Chinese they just have one. Everything's the same, and I'm like, well, they only had one, but it did not lead to better conditions for women.
right.
So, maybe people's theory about language use is not correct, but it's interesting to see the differences and how it affects what you're saying. And yet, to a certain degree, we are telling a whole human experience that can come out in any language. I mean, a lot of good books and good movies and good shows can be translated.
Yeah. And
You
it's
know?
it's it's not that crazy, and a lot of it's a function of culture. Chinese culture is incredibly collectivist, and that was before communism took
Yeah,
place.
yeah,
They basically serve the state as one of their gods, besides the ancestors who also serve the state, and the whole Confucian ideal. But then you have like kind of the English language or the French language, where individuality is far more important. So our language reflects that. And of course, when you're writing a book, when you're writing a culture, that stuff does need to be taken into account. If you have, orcs who are basically rangers, they would have a language that would be incredibly individualistic. But if you have
yeah.
a race of ant people, they would have more of a Chinese model.
Have you ever read the book Languages of Pow by Jack Vance?
No, I haven't.
It's short and it's really interesting. The setup of the book is that somebody becomes convinced that if you change the language, you can change the people. So they try to make like a warrior language for one people and a worker. I can't remember exactly what the languages were, but they tried teaching different languages to different people to try to change their character. And being Jack Vance, it doesn't really go as they had hoped. But I really enjoyed that book.
Yeah. And
I recommend.
he's absolutely right. But that's
Yeah,
world building. Do you have a
yeah.
world building class in the art of craft of writing?
I have what I'll call a world building placeholder, by
Ah,
which I mean I was asked if I would do one, and I have a chapter for it, but it's not written yet because it's one that I feel like it needs we're getting these first ones out, and that I need to work on it a bit because while I've done a lot of like talking about world building on panels and stuff, I've
yeah,
never actually written about it. But I do think that there's a lot of interesting, like between John and I, we have a lot of thoughts and observations. I just need to put them down on paper in a way that's clear and graspable. A lot of this comes down to there's something that I've thought about, and then I wanted to understand how it worked. And then once I get a grasp on how it works, I try to find a way to present it so that another person can also understand how it works. So the
yep,
key is now for me to take what I know about world building and see if I can figure out how to grasp it and codify it.
yeah,
Because I have a lot of thoughts I think would be helpful, and I'd probably get some input from John on it. John's the kind of guy who he ran a role playing game in college. He started with the plate tectonics of the planet and worked up. And does amazing work.
right.
He's working on Star Quest. He had to throw together a quick timeline of the last 12,000 years.
just a real casual thing. I
Yeah,
actually
you
like, and
know.
and it shows off in his work. It's like, and even then you start noticing patterns and things like that. Like in some weather, um, most of the planets that are resisting the Uros, use water in their thing, and I don't know whether that's an intent to block off somehow, the advance of the enemy, and I
Yeah,
don't know if that's intentional or not. You can ask him, but um, like you noticed
yeah,
patterns. Like if you put
yeah,
in the
yeah,
work into your story, it'll pay off.
yeah, yeah,
Once you, if you, the only really, and even then you still kind of have to, because you have to figure out all the decadence that you have to put in. If you have a decadent society, sure,
yeah, yeah.
they're not exactly going to have meaningful art, but you better, figure out in what way are they decadent, and how is their destruction going to be manifest.
Yeah, and it may be similar to ours and it may be different because if you look at
Hmm.
history, and that's one of the things that, I'm talking about, the classes that, I have or haven't finished. One of the ones that I have a couple towards what I call the bottom because I deal first with, like the basic craft grammar, and then I have all the ones on the basic plots and things like that. But I have a few that are ones that people have asked for that I have in my list that I haven't actually done.
Hmm.
And one of them is, and it may or may not be the same as world building depending on how I decide to go about the whole thing. But
Hmm.
um, one of them is on creative research,
Ooh.
which I think is really what we're looking at, which is how to look at history and sit down and study something particular and then take that information and turn it into your made up background so that you
Yep.
keep the feel of yeah, I think that's actually what I have in my notes for the world building is, making the imaginary real from that point of view of how to do the research and then turn it into something that feels real. Because there's kind of like a bit of an art to it, with
Hmm.
how to look at the way a medieval town was set up and then take that and make it so that you have the same feeling. Because really what's going on is it's cause and effect is what we look at, get a sense of how the world works.
Yeah.
So the more effect that anything has in your story, whether it's the effect of a change in the magic system and the laws of nature or the effect of the personality, the more real it feels to the author, to the reader.
Hmm.
So part of the key is how do I show the effects? Let's say I want to have a magical drink that does something nice. How do I make it more realistic by showing the secondary side effects? You know? So you
Hmm.
look at something like in the Middle Ages, there were alewives. A woman couldn't really do a lot of things, but one thing she could do was make ale. That was the main thing a lot of people drank. So it was okay for a woman to make and sell ale, particularly if her husband was ill or away for a while because he had a job where he had to travel, or maybe she
Hmm.
was a widow. And they'd have these doors where you open the top and you can, buy and sell the ale. Um, and so that was just a little thing that was kind of neat that we don't normally think about. Well, then,
Yeah.
okay, so take this idea of the alewife and this need in society, and then, put in your magical drink, and then think about how that would change it. What does she need to do in order to make the magic drink? So you do little things like that, and you make it so that your research has the feeling of what real research feels like, even though you've changed the content of the research. So that's one thing that I haven't written about yet, that I've talked about, with some of these subjects are things I've talked about in person on panels and things for years. That's
Yeah.
one of the ones that I, talk to people about, but I haven't actually written up something that was practical and step by step on that I will add if, all goes well and there's some demand and people would like to, see later uh, classes as we go along.
Yeah.
That's one of the ones is the creative research class.
one of my favorite professors in college actually studied ale and England. And one of the things that happened is that it reversed in the Victorian times. And women, like, there weren't really alewives anymore, at least in the
Yeah,
cities.
yeah.
So women couldn't go into pubs mostly because, virtue and vice and all that stuff. And then, um, what happened was is that they would send children, and it's like, okay, here's a pound, here's some pence, go and buy x amount of jugs of ale for our women sitting knitting circle or whatever, and they would go and do that. Another time, some guy got beat up, and he was so drunk he couldn't stand up. His wife picked him up, and then challenged the guy who beat up her husband to a fight, and then proceeded to beat him up once he actually came out to fight her. Like, you have all these different things. So in one part of the culture at one time, you had alewives.
Right.
Then,
And then another time you went the other direction. And you're
yeah,
absolutely right. And that kind of thing, one of the things that I think John does very well, I remember a scene in one of the Golden Age books where the guy is camping out in these broken, old, forgotten houses, and the forgotten
mm-hmm,
houses have technologies that are way ahead of anything we've ever heard of, but they're so old-fashioned that they're, completely junk from compared to the time of the future.
yep,
One of the things that's really cool is to give a little bit of a sense of time by having a custom have changed.
yeah,
So, if you can have somebody remembering in my grandmother's day, we were allowed to do this and now we're not, that gives you a little sense of that sense of reality because in reality, things change and it makes it feel, and it's particularly nice with these things if they're light touches. If they're heavy touches, if it's a main issue, it gives a different feel. It then becomes the main issue you're dealing with.
mm-hmm,
But the thing that really gives that real feeling of reality about the is the light touches where you think of something that's a secondary or third effect of something and you have it there and it makes it feel more real, but you don't spend much time on it.
yeah.
It's just kind of in the background. The woman mentions it and then next thing. I
I
do
was
want to mention just go ahead.
well, I was thinking, like, it's like as simple as, like, what decoration. So you mentioned a woman. The woman has a shawl. What's her brooch?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
is it
exactly.
like
Yep.
like a Gaelic cross? Is it a one of those more pagan symbols? Like, you can do a whole lot with
Yeah, with
just.
a little thing like that. Yeah.
Mm,
One of the questions that I have on my list of, for interviewing your character is what object does your character have that doesn't fit his personality at all? Maybe like a grandmother left it to him or, somebody gave it to him
mm-hmm.
as a gift. And that's kind of that kind of thing where you have to stop and think, okay, well, what's my character like and what's different from him? And then how did he get it? And now suddenly you have a little bit of history and maybe a relative or a friend or a crazy night, where he came home drunk and doesn't know why he has this lampshade or whatever.
Right, right.
On the subject of research, I recommend to everyone a website called, I think it's called All Things Medieval by Ruth Johnston. There are more than one All Things Medieval, but this is the Ruth Johnston one. And I just want to take a moment to tell the history of this website because it's such a wonderful place if you want any sort of medieval research of any kind. So, Ruth Johnson happens to be a friend of mine, and she was hired to write a textbook. And
Mm.
she owns what she wrote, but she doesn't own the pictures. And you can buy this textbook on Amazon for like $180. But Ruth said, she's ill, she's a shut in, she's has wants to be doing something worthwhile with her time, even though sometimes she's limited in what she can do. So
She's
she
a
been
private
putting
individual.
yeah, so she put together this website where she started putting all her research and all that had been in this textbook. It's just out there for free. And it's
Mm.
one article at a time. So you can sit there and read about, how was a squire raised? How was a guy who went into the crafts raised? And, what
Yeah.
did they eat here? And what was on Charlemagne's list of things he ate? And one thing I found was so interesting was about how the great fairs and the effect of the great fairs and how they would come up through France, and how when the French king got too greedy and started taxing the fares too high, they shut down and people improved their ships so they could sail around France instead of having to go through it. And that's what led to them being able to sail to the New World and the age of exploration that came. And if the King of France had not done that, they might never have improved the ships because they were just gone where they went before, you know?
Yep.
Little things like, and it's really enjoyable to read. Like I read them when I was doing history class with teenagers, and they're really interesting. They're well written, and each one is full of wonderful little specific details that are perfect for the writer. So
Yeah.
that's an example of a source that I recommend because it's really interesting. You can search by subject.
Yeah.
She has a whole fascinating you know, like I don't know, like 5 articles about Lent and what Lent did and how they went about it and what it was like then, which are really neat. Things like that, just
Yeah.
really interesting.
So it's
So I,
like
I recommend that one.
So I didn't know that particular fact, but I do know that Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal and other places was really motivated to skip like the Muslim trade routes and the Silk Road and
Yeah,
stuff like that, which is so far from them. And guess what? It's taxes, but it's also the fact that they just had this epic conflict, of 500 years retaking an entire, the
yeah,
Iberian Peninsula of Europe, the Reconquista. So not only do you have like the epic battles that you can write about, you have tax policy that actually matters. So all of a sudden now you have all these different motivations
yeah.
and
And
a cash motivation for it as well.
and one of the things that she goes over that I think is a great thing for writers, fees and taxes were like the
Mm-hmm.
main thing of the Middle Ages. We think of it as like somehow living in this pastoral sense, but no, like who had the right to throw a fair because you could get money from it was a huge thing. Everything had a fee or a tax that went with it. And
Yep.
one thing that I think would be great for fantasy that I have never seen anybody use, I mean, they may be out there, I haven't read everything, but a lot of fairs had their own courts because if somebody didn't, like, you're there at the fair and you're only there for 3 days and somebody rips somebody off or doesn't keep their word, there's no time to go through the normal court system. So you
Mm-hmm.
actually had your own judges and your own courts. And that would be like, I could imagine a science fiction story on a spaceship that somehow developed from like the old traveling court system. You know what I mean? It just
Right.
seems like you could do a lot with that. There's a lot of fodder there for interesting ideas that are a little different than what we think of today. So
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a good example from studying the past. Jack Vance does this a lot, but studying the past can be just as helpful for science fiction
Oh yes.
because instead of taking it and adding magic, you take it and you go, how can I make it high tech?
Mm-hmm.
But you're looking for those same little day-to-day details of how did a person pay their bill? How did a person solve a problem?
Mm-hmm.
So
It's
that's
if
something we'll get to eventually
Yeah.
in our
I mean, if everyone's going around in Mecca, and you can't pierce their armor, and it requires of great expense to have Mecca, of course you'd return to knights and all that
exactly,
jazz again,
exactly.
just
And if
because.
you,
Yeah.
well, I was just saying, if you understand why they had it to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
and what that's, why did they have Magna Carta? Why, what are the other pressures that it created? You can recreate that in a shiny space version and have a same sense of reality to it. But a reader might have no idea that they were looking at something that was actually medieval. You know what I mean? Depending
Yep.
on how well you filed off the serial numbers and gave it a new shine there, good paint
and
job.
and don't forget, like there's a reason why like the English had a Magna Carta, but the French just started murdering people.
Yeah,
Like the French wouldn't have a Magna Carta, and people might say, well, French was the language of the land of the nobles, and the Normans were from France. No, the Normans were Vikings, and they had a long history of raiding England and having English wives, consensual or otherwise. And you get these different characters going around, and you don't necessarily have them act the same way based on their culture.
yeah,
If you have
yeah.
space Britons, they will be fundamentally different than space Danes.
It's true. There is an excellent series out there about Magna Carta. done by, I don't know. See, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's really interesting. And the fascinating thing about it was it shows the Magna Carta was derived basically from the Bible.
Yeah.
It came from, it was basically a document saying we want the same rights we had before this started. And it came for the rights that came from Alfred the Great, who got his ideas from Patrick, who got them from Rome. And it's just fascinating, like how it came down and how this led to the freedom of modern Britain and then of America,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole system traces back, to the ancient Jew system that then goes in the Bible, that then comes to the Christians, that then comes to Patrick, that then comes to Alfred the Great, that then comes through to Magna Carta, that then comes through to the Parliament that leans on that.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating, and again, that's an example of the kind of thing where a little bit of historical research can be so valuable for almost anything, because you can just take it and then fit it to your background and apply it. So
And of course,
that's
like this go if you, and then you apply it to the future as things go on beyond
yeah,
the Magna Carta. Why did England take to Protestantism so strongly? And even before the Protestant Reformation, you had people like Wycliffe and others who were wandering around England trying to get an English
yeah,
Bible printed, trying to get this and that done, that were not exactly approved by the popes of that era. And I'm keeping that a very neutral statement. But, and he was later like exhumed after his death and then burned as a heretic. So, you have all these different things going around. So you had this independent streak who know their rights, who desire not some rulership or wealth or revenge or whatever, but rather that holier good than they were able to do themselves. You can present it on there. Then you have, why did Protestantism take hold in America? Is there a connection between, and I'm speaking this from St. Louis, which is a very Catholic city, but it was also settled by the French and not the English at first.
yeah.
Anyway, that's I've concurrent with this. I had been writing last year anyway, the Necronomicon Ascetica, where I've been thinking about these things, but it came out quite confusing and jumbled. So if you want a trip, check out the Superversive blog and look for the Necronomicon Ascetica. But if you really want things to be simplified, for what you're doing, but you need that little extra nitro in the tanks. Definitely check out the Art and Craft of Writing on Indiegogo and back it. These things don't get made unless they're backed. Fortunately, we are right now just taking victory laps around the track with a 125% achieved goal. Thank you, everyone.
Indeed, indeed. And I should mention, it's also a good deal in that,
Hmm.
we'll probably sell each individual one for like $5. I'm sure there'll be a discount if you buy a group of them. But if you back them, it should be a cheaper way of getting them if you're interested in the future. So, I mean, in addition to everything else, it's a good deal as far as if you think you might like it at some point. You can get a lot of them for less money than it would take otherwise. So thank you so much, Ben. That was great. That was a lot of fun. And, it's fun to talk about these things. It's fun to talk about stories and how they go together. And a lot of the whole point of the art and craft of writing is some insights into how to do this and some practical hands on steps to help you understand. And I kind of like just the last thing. I gave the course this summer a short version for a group of teenagers, and a couple of the older people came back in again. And I was particularly pleased that it was a young man who was the son of a British professor who took the class, and he's a teenager. I can't remember how old he is now, somewhere in his late teens. And he said, I especially like how you simply laid out ideas about stories and characters, which instantly made me go, oh, yeah, I've seen that before. I felt these were techniques that would have taken me ages to work out on my own, and seeing them simply stated had seriously helped me as a writer, or has, sorry, so has seriously helped me as a writer. And I like that because that was what I was trying to do. My goal here is to take stuff that when you see it, you'll go, oh, yeah, and it'll help you just part of taking the class is that you yourself bring your own experience and you realize, yeah, I know how to do that.
Yeah.
But you now have this tool that when you sit down, you can go, oh yeah, I need to do that thing in order to get my character to come across a little better, you know? So
Yep.
that's I think a great sum up of what the purpose of the course is. So thank you so much.
And of course, it's getting the words for it as much as anything else. But thank
Indeed.
you for joining me today. I really hope everyone who's been listening, does check it out if you haven't already. And I'll probably do a solo stream or maybe with one or two of the more superversive friends next week to talk about Tears of Elfland, which, it's one of those things where it's like taking care of everyone else, and it's like, oh wait, my book. And
Yeah.
it's I'll be sort of talking about it, thoughts about it, as well as sort of thinking about Dragon Con and selling the books directly to the
Yeah,
people.
you should talk about that because your book was a hit at Dragon.
Oh yeah, and it's I regret that we didn't have more of your book and more of my
And your
book.
book. I mean, we could have used more of both of them. You know,
Oh
they,
yeah,
they 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 went very quickly, so that was a lot of fun.
Scott's book
All right,
too,
Ben.
kinda. Anyway,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
yeah, all right, I'm gonna let you go, Jaji. Thank you so much.
Take care and thank you so much.
Have a great night, guys.